Hey guys, today we're going to talk about some famous people throughout history and modern times that have been killed by their doctors. And this list I've called my top 10. It's just kind of to organize it. There's a lot of honorable mentions in here as well. We're going to start here a little bit farther back in history. Charles II, also known as Charles the Bad, at 54 years old, he reportedly fell into a state of decay that he could not make use of his limbs, so he consulted his physician, who ordered him to be wrapped up from head to foot in a linen cloth impregnated with brandy. So a cloth soaked in brandy, sewed all the way around him as a sack. That night, one of the female attendants who was in charge of sewing up this sack around him, turning him into a human sack, when she finished up at the neck, instead of cutting the thread, reportedly she used a candle, and of course the whole thing lit up in flames, causing him to be burned to death, basically at the order of his doctors, bringing him to number 10 on this list. Okay, I'm giving the number 9 spot to Napoleon. The story always went that he died at 51 years old on St. Helena when he was exiled after losing the Battle of Waterloo, and that's true, and it's most likely cited that he died of stomach cancer, and it's true that he was a sick person, but also in his history he had mistreatment from doctors on record, and at the end, recent evidence suggests that he was actually killed by his doctors. In 2001, French forensic specialists said that tests on Napoleon's hair suggested a major exposure to arsenic. They say it was more likely that it was the treatments given to Napoleon in an attempt to cure him that actually killed him. He was given regular doses of antimony potassium tartrate, a poisonous colorless salt which was used to make him vomit. He was also given regular enemas. Now, P.S. enemas aren't really pleasant in this modern time, and I can really only imagine what it was like in Napoleon's time or further than that. And it's kind of interesting to think of some of these world leaders, such as Napoleon, being given enemas on their last day, useless enemas. The researchers say this would have caused a serious potassium deficiency, which can lead to a potentially fatal heart condition, in which rapid heartbeats disrupt blood flow to the brain. They say the final straw is likely to have been a 600 milligram dose of mercuric chloride given as a purge to clear the intestines 2 days before his death. This was 5 times the normal dose and would have depleted his potassium levels still further, they say. They went on to say that it wasn't the arsenic killing him, his doctors did him in. For number 8, we'll jump to more modern times for a famous case, Nicole Smith, who was not on party drugs. She was on 9 different prescription drugs and under the care of doctors, so her death is ruled ultimately accidental overdose by prescription medication, aka killed by doctors. And she was only 39 years old. On to number 7, King Charles II. In his lifetime, he was king of England, Scotland, and Ireland at various times. At 54 years old, King Charles wakes up to a dreadful shriek and developed convulsions and speechlessness. His doctors were there, and they first thing they did, they show up and they bleed him 16 ounces, about a pint of blood. Then they cupped him, they scarified him, and blistered him. They gave him emetics, cathartics, and enemas, again with the enemas. They bled him again after that, another 8 ounces, and this was all before noon. In the afternoon, they gave him a sacred bitter powder. The next day, the king had another convulsion. The doctors prescribed another sacred tincture, hourly. They prescribed some other things, some cream of tartar. They bled him another 10 ounces and blistered him. And they were also giving him a whole bunch of medications and herbal stuff like mallow root and barley water and almonds, melon seeds, bark of elm, lavender, powdered pearls, lily of the valley, flowers of lime, black cherry water, white wine, senna, manna, chamomile, gentian, nutmeg, followed by spirit of human skull. The next day, this is 3 days of this, he asked to see the light of the rising sun, after which he became acutely breathless and was bled another 12 ounces. His speech failed, he became unconscious, and he died before noon. Number 6, we've got President James Garfield. When he was 49 years old, he was shot in the back and another bullet grazed his arm, and it's commonly cited that he was killed by this assassination, but even the guy who was hanged for his killing said, "I may have shot him, but his doctors killed him." Because he was in treatment for 11 weeks, but as soon as the doctors got there, they started poking around in his open wounds with their dirty hands because they did not believe that germs existed at that time. So ultimately, the infection killed him, and even Wikipedia says his doctors killed him. He died by infection. I'm going to give an honorable mention here to President Abraham Lincoln, who, although he was shot in the head, many people have survived being shot in the head, being shot in the brain, and he didn't die right away. He was coherent, and his doctors were poking around inside of his open wound, again, probably with unclean hands, as was the normal in their time, because doctors at that time, medical doctors, official medical doctors, did not believe in germs. So, could he have survived? Quite possibly. Number 5 spot I'm giving to Prince, because Prince was known to take care of himself, and even with drugs and alcohol, he was known to not really go overboard. He wanted to live a long time, he was concerned about his legacy, but he was in pain all the time, so his doctors gave him various drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, to cope with his pain, and they say what ultimately killed him was a fentanyl overdose, which of course is killing many people. It's a big deal here. We could mention Tom Petty in here as well, killed by fentanyl. Although Prince was a better example of good health than Petty, so that's why he gets the spot. But he was under the care of doctors, and he did have chronic pain, he did have digestive problems, he had health problems that his doctors were not able to do anything about. They just gave him more and more drugs, and ultimately, that is what killed him. So it was death by doctor, but combination of negligence and not being able to help his underlying problems, and then overdosing, of course, by their toxic prescription drugs. I'm actually going to give a 5.5 spot here to Michael Jackson, who is pretty much in the same scenario. He wasn't out there partying, doing a bunch of crazy drugs. He wasn't shooting heroin into his veins. He wasn't a raging alcoholic. He was addicted to prescription drugs. They were giving him more and more sleeping pills. He was also in chronic pain, chronic digestive pain. And Michael Jackson also had visible signs of the digestive problem. He did have the vitiligo visible, very evident. Everybody said he bleached his face. So it's not true. He just wore makeup over the rest of his face. And this is a nutrient deficiency, and this is caused by a digestive problem, which again his doctors should have been able to help him with. And drugs were not the answer. And ultimately, in the same scenario, drugs is what killed Michael Jackson too. And Michael Jackson's doctor was actually given a short prison term for overprescribing drugs. The number 4 spot goes to Andy Warhol. Now, some people say that it was actually a bullet wound sustained in 1968 when he was gunned down, and they say that killed him many years later, 19 years later in 1987, and I don't buy that. He went in for gallbladder surgery, and he didn't die as a direct result of the surgery. He actually died because the nurse watching over him afterwards while he was under anesthesia fell asleep, and one of the tubes clogged up, and he died. So it was direct medical negligence, not from a doctor directly, but from a nurse. I would say though that since he was such a famous person, and although he wasn't known to take care of his own health, in fact he was known to blatantly neglect it, he was under the care of doctors. He did have money, he was rich, he was famous. He could have had a doctor, if it wasn't a medical doctor, who would have told him about the nutritional things that he needs to do in order to not have gallstones and not need a gallbladder surgery in the first place, removing all of the possible things that could go wrong in a surgery or after a surgery. And number 3, we've got Neil Armstrong, the astronaut. And though he was 82 years old, he was convinced to do an elective, meaning unnecessary, cardiovascular surgery for an issue that was not likely to kill him. So for the tough guy that he was known, I just find it interesting that he allowed some doctors to do an unnecessary surgery and kill him early. He probably could have gone on. No reason why he couldn't have gotten more time in and, died at home with his family peacefully rather than being killed at the hospital. And it's good to note that his doctors and the nurses and everybody involved will still be getting paid for the procedure. Insurance will still go through. It will just be called an accident. So number 2 on this list could easily be number 1. President George Washington. Just 2 years after he finished his presidency, he reportedly went to a dinner, sat through it with wet clothes on, and this led to him having a cough and basically a cold. And when he woke up the following morning, he was clutching his chest with a profound shortness of breath. A few hours later, he developed a pronounced fever. His throat was raw with pain, and his breathing became even more labored. And then at 7:30 that morning, the doctor arrived to remove 12 to 14 ounces of blood. After which Washington himself requested that he remove still more. He was given a tonic of molasses, butter, and vinegar, which nearly choked Washington to death. So inflamed were the beefy red tissues of his infected throat. Another doctor entered at 9 a.m. After taking the medical history, he applied a painful blister of cantharides, better known as Spanish fly, to Washington's throat. The idea behind this torturous treatment was based on a humoral notion of medicine dating back to antiquity called counter-irritation. The blisters raised by this toxic stuff would supposedly draw out the deadly humors, causing the general's throat inflammation. At 9:30 a.m., another bloodletting of 18 ounces was performed, followed by a similar withdrawal at 11 a.m. At noon, an enema was administered. Attempts at gargling with sage tea laced with vinegar were unsuccessful, but Washington was still strong enough to walk about his bedroom for a bit and sit upright in an easy chair for a few hours. His real challenge was breathing once he returned to lying flat on his back in bed. The doctors ordered another bleeding. This time 32 ounces were removed, even though the second doctor objected to this. A third doctor arrived at 4 p.m. He suggested a dose of calomel, mercury chloride, and tartar emetic, which is an antimony potassium tartrate. We've already been introduced to these compounds. Guaranteed to make the former president vomit with a vengeance. After the fourth bloodletting, Washington appeared to rally somewhat. At 5 p.m., he was having an easier time swallowing and even had the energy to examine his last will and testament with Martha, his wife. Soon after, he was again struggling for air. He told the doctors he's not afraid to go. At 8 p.m., blisters were applied to his feet, arms, and legs, while wheat poultices were placed upon his throat with little improvement. At 10 p.m., Washington murmured some last words about burial instructions, and within the hour after that, he was dead. So this started from a cold. He was complaining of a cold and a sore throat, pretty basic, just being sick, and they bled him to death over it. His doctors bled him to death. And before I get to my number one spot, I do want to give honorable mention to some people that could have made the list, but they were either too similar to people already on the list, or they just fall into a category like HIV/AIDS drugs. People like Keith Haring, Freddie Mercury, and Arthur Ashe, and a whole list of others, in my contention, are dead because of their doctors. Again, because their doctors failed to actually help them and gave them drugs that ultimately killed them. So both negligence and direct malicious incompetence with overprescription of absolutely deadly pharmaceuticals that clearly do not solve the problem, whether it's AIDS or a simple complication. So there's quite a huge list of people that we could throw in here with overdoses of various drugs, not just AIDS drugs. But let's get on here to what I think is my number one. And there is some contention about how exactly Alexander the Great did die, but I do believe that his doctors had at least one major thing going against them, and this is the reported fact that his body did not begin to decompose out there in the hot Babylonian sun for 6 days after his doctors declared him dead. And this means to me and to many other people that he was actually alive. He was in some sort of comatose state, and of course they were doing all kinds of things to him in his last days, but they overall were not able to help him. But I'm sure within 6 days something could have been done. Something could have been done. So if he wasn't sitting out there half dead, maybe history would have been a little bit different. And a reminder here, Alexander the Great conquered much of the known world. He died at 32 years old. So if all his accomplishments are really true, you can imagine what else he could have done with another 30 years, another 40 years. So Alexander the Great might have been poisoned, he might have had tuberculosis. Either way, his doctors were not able to help him. He was wrongly pronounced dead 6 days early, and we have no idea what type of interventions could have been available to him if that were not the case. And what we find here back in 300 BC seems to be pretty similar to what we find in the modern day. The people who call themselves doctors or physicians, especially those appointed to important people, seem to really have no actual idea on how to help people with many of the major complications and everyday problems that they go to a doctor for. And I guess the lesson to us is this might not be what we really need in our life. We might not need these types of medical treatments, and some of these do seem quite brutal, but in the modern day, it's really just been replaced with lots and lots of pharmaceutical drugs, plenty of surgeries available, and an endless amount of tests that you can do. And at every stage, a medical doctor or professional or assistant is definitely being paid by the insurance, and that's really all that matters in the medical industry, back in the past and in modern times. So I hope you guys appreciated this video. I appreciate you, and if you are interested in more looking into death videos, I've got a bunch more. I've got a playlist here, and that's for animals and different types of humans as well. So that's it for now, guys. Thank you. See you next time.